When I bought my house in Maple Hollow, it felt like a dream. Quiet cul-de-sac, mature oak trees, a backyard that opened into a patch of woods. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. And after my divorce, owning something I could call my own meant everything. The first few weeks were peaceful. I kept to myself mostly, met a few neighbors, waved when I passed people on walks. And then I met Carl. Carl looked like he'd walked straight out of a "Don't Tread on Me" Facebook group. Cargo shorts, mirrored sunglasses, and an inflated sense of authority. Turns out he was the HOA president, self-appointed, re-elected every year, unopposed, because no one else wanted the headache. "Hey neighbor," he said the first time he showed up on my driveway uninvited. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. We've got rules about fencing here. You planning on putting one in?" I smiled politely. "Yeah, just a small one on the side. Privacy, mostly." He nodded, but his tone shifted. "Well, make sure you clear it with the architectural committee first. Can't have people doing their own thing. That's how neighborhoods go downhill." I said I'd look into it. What I didn't know at the time was that the architectural committee was just Carl and his buddy Steve, who conveniently lived 3 doors down and never got violations for anything, even though his garage looked like a scrapyard. Still, I followed the rules. I filled out the forms, attached the design mock-up, and even submitted the contractor's name and insurance, just like the HOA packet said. And then I waited. 3 weeks passed. Nothing. No approval, no denial, just silence. So I emailed, then called. Still nothing. My contractor was holding the materials for me, but he couldn't wait forever. So, with everything submitted and no rejection, I figured, like the HOA guidelines stated, no response within 30 days meant implied approval. We started building. It wasn't anything dramatic. A 6-foot wooden privacy fence on the left side of my backyard, same style as half the homes on the block. But the day we started digging post holes, Carl showed up again, and this time, he wasn't smiling. "I didn't approve this," he barked. "You didn't reject it either," I replied calmly. "And your bylaws say no response in 30 days means it's considered approved." Carl stepped closer. "You're not special. You don't get to decide when rules apply." Before I could respond, he pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the fence, of my contractor's truck, of me. That night, I got an official violation letter on my porch, not mailed, not emailed, just stuffed in an envelope and duct taped to my door like some petty middle school prank. "Unapproved structure, must be removed immediately." I didn't react, not publicly, but inside, something snapped. I wasn't going to be bullied off my own property. The next morning I installed 2 security cameras, one facing the front driveway, the other covering the backyard and fence. And that's when things really took a turn. A few nights later, just past midnight, I was lying in bed when my phone buzzed. Motion detected. Backyard camera. I tapped the app and saw a figure creeping along the edge of my yard with a flashlight. It was Carl. He was pacing the fence, muttering to himself, holding something in his hand. I zoomed in. It was a handgun. My heart raced. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Carl stood there, pointing the gun toward the fence, whispering, then turned and walked away, vanishing back into the dark. I stared at the footage. My hands were shaking. That wasn't just harassment anymore. That was intimidation. Maybe even a threat. The next day I made 3 copies of the video, one on a USB, one uploaded to the Clue's house, and one sent to a friend. Then I filed a police report. I wasn't sure what would come of it. Carl had friends in the neighborhood, and apparently some influence, but I wasn't backing down. I had footage, I had proof, and the next HOA meeting was just days away. The morning after filing the police report, I waited for a knock on the door, a call, anything. Instead, I got another notice taped to my door. This one was typed in bold red font. Final warning. Unauthorized construction. Daily fines of $150 will begin effective immediately. Carl wasn't backing down. He was doubling down. I emailed the HOA with the subject line, "Pending police investigation. Immediate cease of harassment requested." No reply. Not from the board, not from Carl, not from anyone. That night, I called the non-emergency police line to check in. The officer confirmed the report had been logged and the video had been added as evidence. But unless Carl made a direct threat or entered my property, they said, it was a gray area. Gray area? A man walked up to my property, armed, in the middle of the night after repeatedly harassing me, and I was told it wasn't enough. But then the officer added, "If you see him on your property again, call 911 immediately and bring a copy of that footage to your HOA meeting if you feel unsafe." That's public record. Public record. That stuck in my head. So I printed still frames from the video. Clear shots of Carl's face, the flashlight, the weapon. I made a full-color packet with timestamps, camera angles, and even a map of where he stood in relation to my property line. And then, I dressed up for the HOA meeting. The meetings were usually held in the community clubhouse. Half the chairs were always empty, and most of the attendees came just for the cookies. But this time, the room was packed. Word had spread, probably thanks to Carl's drama about my fence. A few neighbors shot me sympathetic looks. Most avoided eye contact. Carl stood at the front of the room in a tucked-in polo, clipboard in hand, acting like a low-budget dictator. He opened the meeting with a reminder about community standards and the need to enforce rules equally. And then he said my name. "Before we move on," Carl began, "I want to address a homeowner who has knowingly violated our architectural guidelines by installing an unauthorized fence." He gestured toward me like I was some criminal. Despite multiple written notices and clear communication from this board, this resident has refused to comply. As such, daily fines have been issued and a lien may be pursued. He paused for effect. I stood up slowly, holding the packet in my hand. "Is it my turn to speak?" I asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Carl blinked. "Homeowners will have a chance to comment after the agenda is." "I have the right to speak now," I cut in, "especially since I'm being named publicly." He opened his mouth to argue, but I didn't wait. I walked to the front of the room and placed a stack of papers on the table in front of him. "This is a still image from my security camera, Carl. That's you at 12:47 a.m. pacing my fence with a handgun." A hush fell over the room. You could hear the AC humming in the silence. Carl's face drained of color. That's taken out of context." "No," I said. "What's out of context is the intimidation you've subjected me to for weeks. What's out of context is you trespassing with a weapon because I built a legally permitted fence." I turned to the room. "I filed a police report. They have the footage. And now, so do all of you." I passed copies down the rows of chairs. Neighbors leaned in, whispering, eyes wide. Carl tried to laugh it off. "This is ridiculous. I was just checking on a possible code violation." "With a gun?" someone shouted. From the back. The room shifted. Suddenly, the power Carl had always leaned on, the fear, the control, the fake authority, started to crack. I locked eyes with him. "You abused your position. You tried to intimidate me. You used a weapon to settle a personal grudge." And then, as if it had been rehearsed, the door opened. 2 police officers stepped in. "Mr. Carlson Briggs?" one of them asked. Carl froze. "We need to speak with you regarding an active investigation. Please step outside." The gasps were immediate. Chairs scraped as people stood. Someone actually dropped a cookie. Carl tried to keep it together. I'll be right back. We can resume the meeting shortly." He never came back in. When Carl was escorted out of the clubhouse by 2 uniformed officers, you could hear a pin drop. The man who'd barked orders, handed out fines like candy, and ruled the HOA like a petty dictator was suddenly just a guy being questioned by the police in front of 30 stunned neighbors. No handcuffs, no shouting, just quiet, tense confusion. People looked at me like I'd flipped the script on something they didn't even realize could be flipped. The meeting sort of collapsed after that. One of Carl's cronies, Steve, tried to move on with the agenda, but nobody cared about lawn maintenance updates or spring flower budget discussions anymore. People started whispering. Others left early. I packed up my folder, nodded politely, and walked out with my head high. But I wasn't done. The real revenge wasn't Carl getting pulled aside by police. That was just the start. Over the next few days, I did something Carl never expected. I got involved. I went door to door, not to gossip, but to inform. I calmly explained what had happened, that Carl had pulled a firearm while creeping around someone's private property in the middle of the night, that I had submitted proper fence documentation and followed the rules, that the bylaws he waved around were real, but selectively enforced, and that the position of HOA President, it wasn't a throne. It was an elected role, and he'd been running unopposed for 6 years. People listened. Turns out I wasn't the only one Carl had messed with. A woman named Judy told me he once fined her for having seasonal decorations past January 15th. It was January 16th. An older couple said Carl threatened to tow their grandson's car from their driveway during Christmas break. A single dad showed me faded violation notices for trash bins visible from the curb, even though his neighbors left theirs out longer and never got fined. Carl had been playing favorites, and the rest of us had just let it happen. A week later, I got a call from the local PD. Carl hadn't been charged with a felony. The gun was legally owned, and he hadn't fired it. But they did issue a misdemeanor citation for brandishing a weapon in a threatening manner and criminal trespass. He was given a court date, a fine, probation, and a very public record. More importantly, he was temporarily suspended from his HOA duties pending review. That's when I made my next move. I showed up at the emergency board meeting, not to yell, not to gloat, but with a calm, formal petition to remove Carl from office. I had 41 signatures, all homeowners, and I'd spent 2 nights reading the bylaws to make sure it was airtight. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't revenge porn. It was boring, procedural, and completely legal. The board couldn't stop it. A special election was scheduled. And guess what? I ran. Not because I wanted power, but because I knew if I didn't, someone like Carl would just sneak back in after the heat died down. I wasn't the most social neighbor. I wasn't flashy or political, but I was done being pushed around. My campaign? Simple. Transparency, fairness, no more weaponized rule books. People respected it. Election day came. We held it in the same clubhouse where Carl had been escorted out just weeks before. This time, I stood at the front of the room behind a folding table, handing out ballots. Carl didn't even show up. He withdrew quietly the day before the election, citing personal reasons in an HOA-wide email. Not a single person clapped back. Not one person defended him. That night, after the votes were counted and I was officially elected HOA President, I walked out of the clubhouse and past Carl's house. His porch light was off. His truck sat quietly in the driveway. No more patrols, no more clipboard walks. He'd finally been silenced, not with revenge fueled by anger, but with cold, hard accountability. Becoming HOA President wasn't part of the plan. Honestly, I didn't even know where to start. I had a full-time job, a half-built garden in the backyard, and exactly zero interest in arguing about mailbox colors or lawn gnomes. But I also knew what power looked like when it went unchecked, and I wasn't about to let another Carl slide into that seat and start the cycle all over again. So I took it seriously. My first move? Full audit. Every past fine, approval, denial, and complaint filed over the last 5 years. I reviewed them one by one. Took me 2 weekends and a few late nights, but what I found made my blood boil. Carl had rejected nearly 40% of all improvement requests, citing vague, aesthetic violations. Most of those denials were to younger homeowners, single parents, and anyone who pushed back even slightly. He'd also waived fees for his friends, including one guy who built a permanent carport with no permits, and still got HOA funds for landscaping improvement. But what really made my jaw drop? Carl had reimbursed himself nearly $1,800 over the past 2 years. For what? Community inspection fuel costs, which translated to gas money for driving around and handing out citations. None of it was reviewed. None of it had receipts. Just signed off by the board, which, surprise, was Carl and 2 of his buddies. I documented everything. Glided the sketchy expenses, the selective enforcement, the nepotism, the weaponized citations. Then I did what Carl never expected. I printed it all and sent a full HOA transparency report to every single homeowner in the neighborhood. Reactions started coming in fast. Some people were shocked, others weren't. They'd suspected something shady for years. A few folks even apologized to me for not stepping up sooner. The board had never seen this kind of accountability before, and suddenly, the HOA meetings weren't boring anymore. We had actual turnout, real discussions, people speaking up who'd never said a word in public meetings before. I set up open office hours where anyone could come by and ask questions. No intimidation, no hidden rulebook language, just a human conversation. We voted on new policies. A clear, public approval process for home improvements, financial reviews by an outside accountant once a year, a rule preventing any one person from serving more than 2 consecutive terms as president. Carl's little kingdom? Officially dismantled. But here's the kicker. A month into my term, I got a call from a local investigative journalist. Someone had forwarded my HOA report, probably one of the younger homeowners who worked in media. She asked for an interview. At first I hesitated. I didn't want to turn this into some neighborhood scandal drama, but then I thought Carl had used his power in the dark. Maybe it was time to shine a little light, so I said yes. The piece ran under the headline, "When HOA Power Turns Toxic, a Quiet Neighborhood's Battle Against Intimidation." They didn't mention names directly, for legal reasons, but the story was clear, and the message? Even clearer. Power doesn't belong to the loudest voice, it belongs to the people willing to listen. That same week, Carl finally moved out. For sale sign popped up quietly. No farewell parties, no thanks for the memories, just a moving truck and a closed garage door. Word was he settled out of court over the trespassing and weapon brandishing charge, agreed to probation and paid a fat fine to avoid trial. He's probably out there somewhere, walking another neighborhood with a clipboard, dreaming of power. But not here, not anymore. It's been 8 months since that night in the clubhouse. The night Carl's little empire cracked open and the truth spilled out. And if you'd told me back then that all this would come from a simple fence, I'd have laughed in your face. But now? Now I know that fences don't just divide properties. Sometimes, they reveal exactly where the lines are drawn between control and community. My fence still stands, same cedar planks, same height. Weathered a bit now, like it belongs. It doesn't scream for attention, it just does its job. Privacy, peace, and a little bit of space that's mine. I added a small raised garden bed next to it. Tomatoes, some basil, the kind of stuff you grow when life finally gives you room to breathe. Funny thing is, people stop and compliment it now. The fence, the garden, the calm. Even Steve, yeah, Carl's old buddy Steve, dropped by one day with a six-pack and an awkward half-apology. Said he didn't realize how bad it had gotten. Said Carl had always been intense, but nobody expected him to pull a gun over a piece of lumber and a property line. I told him the truth. You didn't have to expect it. You just had to notice it when it started. He nodded, and to his credit, he stayed for a beer. As HOA president, I didn't become some saint or hero. There were still arguments about paint colors, still someone complaining that a teenager's car was too loud, still that one neighbor who thinks cycling bins are a government conspiracy. But the difference? Now those conversations happened in the open, with empathy, not fear. People started showing up at meetings with ideas instead of complaints. We held a spring block party. We voted to plant native trees along the walking trail. Someone even suggested a community garden. Not everyone agreed on everything, but that wasn't the point. The point was, we remembered that we were neighbors, not enemies. As for Carl, I never heard from him again. Someone told me he moved to a nearby county, tried to join another HOA board, but the article about him popped up in a background search. He backed off. I don't take joy in his downfall, but I do take pride in knowing that what he tried to bury, with threats, silence, and power, ended up being his undoing. Because I stayed calm, I documented, I followed the rules he thought only he understood. And in the end, the rules worked. For me, not just for him. I think about that night a lot, the moment he pulled a gun and thought fear would win. But I also think about the moment that followed, when I clicked save footage, when I made copies, when I told the truth in front of everyone. That's when the real power shifted. Not with anger, not with violence, with proof, with patience, with a spine. I didn't just build a fence. I built a boundary, against intimidation, against corruption, against silence. And somehow, in defending that space, I found mine.